my staff to distribute something that was stopped into the office and printed out for you today, usdebtclock.org. I brought with me, I've got it up here next to the podium, Uncle Sam's official debt clock, which ticks away as we meet here today at 14 trillion, 599 billion, 107 million, 530,000, 590,000, 630,000, 687, 750,000. The point is, and I'm going to leave it here while I'm speaking, obviously, you all know this, the national debt continues to rise. And so this is an important conversation that we have, and what I want to do is I want to start out by putting it into a broader historic perspective and context. In 1816, Thomas Jefferson said, and I want to quote him, "I place the economy among the first and most important virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared. To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. If we run into such debts, we must be taxed in our meat and our drink, in our necessities and in our comforts, in our labor and in our amusements. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labor of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they will be happy." Sounds like a fairly accurate description of the modern bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., the federal government. It's notable, I believe, because it demonstrates that concern over spending and debt is not a new concern of our generation. However, the current magnitude of our debt and deficits has forced us to address this concern with a new sense of urgency, as they've begun to threaten the very foundation of our economy. The instability in the stock market this week is not only a result of recent downgrade, but also indicative of systemic problems that need to be addressed in the economy. One need look no further than the latest jobs report. Unemployment figures released last week by the Bureau of Labor Statistics show a stubborn unemployment rate of 9.1% and serve as a glaring reminder that we're facing some serious challenges as we struggle to recover from the downturn that our economy took on the eve of the 2008 presidential election. But our financial and economic woes were not made overnight. The near collapse of the United States banking system in 2008 represents the latest in a series of bubbles that have burst over the last 2 decades. In the 1990s, we had the tech wreck, which was followed by the housing bubbles during the 2000s. During each of these cycles, there was a boom period characterized by unsustainable growth, followed inevitably by a bust which was often too big to limit its damage to a single sector of our economy, and as a result, infected the entire economy. It's been said that the next bubble to burst is going to be the bureaucracy. Not just over the past decade, but in fact since the Great Depression, we've seen unprecedented growth of government, both in the scope of regulations and in the terms of federal spending as a percentage of our economy. This boom has been particularly pronounced in recent years. Last week, Treasury announced that our debt has officially surpassed 100% of the GDP. A June Congressional Budget Office report projects that by the end of this year, debt as a percentage of GDP will be at the highest levels since shortly after World War II, thanks to excessive spending, to bank bailouts, auto bailouts, and failed stimulus programs, as well as lower revenues as a result of weakened economy and increasingly high deficits. The projection also points out that while it's likely that deficits will shrink somewhat as we ramp down spending from the stimulus and other recessionary band-aids, the retirement of the baby boomers will put a strain on mandatory spending programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, thus overwhelming the federal budget. The report concludes by stating very plainly that unless something is done to bring our deficits under control, the federal government is on track to cause severe damage to the economy in the form of higher taxes, fewer government services, and higher interest rates. Consider the fact that government spending at all levels accounts for nearly a third of our entire economy. When the bureaucracy bubble bursts, we're all going to feel its effects unless something is done now to prevent this pending crisis. We've already seen the first signs that growth of government has become unsustainable, given the recent news accounts regarding our nation's credit rating. The prognosticators at the CBO aren't the only ones who've noticed that we're in a very precarious financial position. As we heard on Friday night, Standard & Poor's, one of the three primary international credit agencies, made the decision to downgrade our AAA credit rating status to AA. This downgrade marks the first time in our nation's history that our sterling credit rating has ever been challenged. While there are some questions as to what went into their rating, including a $2 trillion error and a cozy relationship between the NRSROs, the credit rating agencies, and Treasury, there should be no confusion as to the message the downgrade sends: reduce deficits and balance the federal budget.
Is that a little better for the back of the room? Okay, I apologize. During the recent debate surrounding the debt ceiling compromise, which was intended to avert the downgrade, I was constantly reminded of the Greek tragedy playing out as we speak. In Athens, you have a government that failed to address its debt crisis in time to avoid brutal austerity measures, which have caused widespread civil disorder in that country. The politicians in Greece thought that they could avoid making the tough decisions that were clearly laid out before them. They thought that they could make it through just one more quarter, or just past one more legislative session. Or maybe they could just buy themselves enough time to let the next guys handle it. The United States cannot engage in the same delay tactics. We followed Greece into democracy. We must not follow them into default. What is often missed in these discussions is that the downgrade from S&P should not come as a surprise to anyone. The rating agency explicitly warned the federal government that we were in danger of downgrade back in April of this year. S&P analyst Nicholas Swan cautioned that more than 2 years after the beginning of the crisis, United States policymakers had still not agreed on how to reverse recent fiscal deterioration or address long-term fiscal pressures. Ms. Swan also noted that from 2003 to 2008, the nation's annual deficit varied between 2% and 5% of GDP. But in 2009, it ballooned to 11% of GDP and is yet to come down. Even as recently as late July, there were warnings from all three major credit rating agencies that simply raising the debt limit alone, as was requested by the President and the Secretary of Treasury, may not be enough to prevent a downgrade of our AAA bond rating. Despite the urgency of the moment, the President failed to lead and the Senate failed to act. They ignored the warnings, like our Greek counterparts, that the problem would simply go away or the government could spend its way to economic prosperity. I serve in the House of Representatives, and I want to talk to you about the actions that we took. In April, the House passed a budget for fiscal year 2012, which restores much-needed fiscal responsibility to the House, known as the Path to Prosperity. This budget not only eliminates hundreds of good programs, institutionalizes a ban on all earmarks, and brings non-security discretionary spending to below pre-2008 pre-stimulus levels. It also establishes market-based reforms to Medicare and Medicaid, which strengthen these programs for current seniors and protects them for future generations of retirees. Frankly, I've taken some heat for my vote for this plan, but something needs to be done to deal with all these government programs. Medicare and Medicaid, also known as autopilot spending programs, have continued to expand to comprise more and more of the federal budget.